Hey, it's Alex again, and today's video is about a Karen so reckless, so obsessively performative that she turned the world's deadliest mountain into a complaint. She mocked Sherpas, complained at rules, and called rest a weakness. And when the storm arrived in the death zone, every other team knew she was already dead. She just didn't know it yet. It was April 3rd, 2019. The Khumbu Icefall doesn't look like a death trap from a distance. From base camp, the Khumbu Icefall looks beautiful, blue-white, ancient, almost inviting. But every serious climber knows it's always moving. You cross it fast, but carefully, because one rush step can mean you never come back down. Bianca Chaya didn't get that memo. By the time I started piecing together what happened on that mountain, the Icefall was where most accounts began. Specifically, where people first started noticing that Bianca wasn't climbing Everest the way anyone else was. She was already treating it like a timed obstacle course, already arguing with her Sherpa team. Not about anchor placements or ice conditions, about pace, about what she kept calling wasted time. I think the obsession with speed on Everest is usually just disguised panic or ego. That phrase came up in account after account. Wasted time. It followed her up the mountain like a bad reputation. Bianca, 34, was a corporate performance consultant from Seattle who treated life like a spreadsheet. Smart, disciplined, and exhausting to be around, she believed most problems came down to inefficiency. To her, Everest wasn't a mountain. It was the ultimate performance test, something to beat, not survive. However, at base camp, the cracks started showing almost immediately. Acclimatization rotations, the structured process of ascending and descending in stages to let your body adjust to thinning oxygen, are not optional on Everest. They're a physiological necessity. Your blood literally needs time to thicken, to produce more red cells capable of carrying oxygen at elevations, where the air holds about a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Guides enforce rotation schedules because the mountain kills people who skip them, and it doesn't always kill them quickly or obviously. Sometimes it just makes them stupid, slower, and prone to bad decisions. Bianca pushed into Camp 1 ahead of schedule. When the expedition guides flagged the timing, she reportedly brushed it off. One of her Sherpas, a veteran with over a dozen Everest summits to his name, later told a fellow guide that she had looked at him during that conversation and said flatly that they're not here to sit around breathing thin air like tourists. The dining tent at base camp became its own kind of legend. Climbers from 3 other expeditions all remembered the same dinner. Bianca had complained loudly, not quietly, not in passing, but loudly, that the food portions were unreasonable given what the expedition cost. She demanded extra eggs while other climbers were still waiting for their first serving. When a staff member explained that supplies were rationed for upper camps and couldn't be redistributed freely, she snapped that she hadn't paid premium prices to eat like a backpacker. The whole tent went silent. People remembered it clearly months later, not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said at altitude, but because of the timing. Because everyone in that tent was about to go up the same mountain, breathe the same thin air, depend on the same ropes and the same support teams. And she had just made very clear how she saw the people around her, not as teammates, not as fellow climbers, but as obstacles with a catering problem. Honestly, that's one of the most revealing ways to see someone's character under stress. After the chaos of the Khumbu Icefall, the groaning ice, the ladder crossings, the constant low-level awareness that the ground beneath you was technically moving, the Western CWM felt almost peaceful. It was a wide, flat glacial valley cradled between the upper shoulders of Everest and Lhotse, shielded from wind by the surrounding ridgelines. On clear days, the sunlight bounced off the snow walls so intensely that climbers came back with sunburns on the undersides of their chins. It was the kind of place that made you forget briefly that you were already above 20,000 feet. Altitude sickness doesn't arrive dramatically. It creeps in. Headache, heavy legs, irritability, bad decisions disguised as confidence. Experienced climbers recognize it early and slow down, because at that altitude, pretending you're fine is often the first mistake. Bianca responded by doubling down on caffeine tablets and pushing her Sherpa team harder. By the time her group moved through the CWM toward Camp 2, her behavior had shifted from abrasive to genuinely disruptive. The verbal outbursts that had started as sharp comments at base camp had escalated into full confrontations. One climber from a separate expedition, who overlapped with her group for 2 days, described overhearing her yell at one of her Sherpas, a man named Wang Yal, experienced and well-regarded among the guiding community, that if he couldn't keep up, she'd find someone who could carry her faster. Wang Yal, by every account, said nothing back, just kept climbing. That restraint said more than anything else could have. She had taken to referring to scheduled rest periods as delays, which sounds like a minor semantic difference, until you understand what rest periods at altitude actually are. They weren't breaks in the recreational sense. They were oxygen checks, gear assessments, fluid intake windows. Guides built them into the schedule because the margin for error above 21,000 feet was nearly non-existent, and small problems, a loose crampon, early dehydration, an oxygen valve running lower than expected, became catastrophic problems very quickly if nobody stopped long enough to catch them. Bianca refused these pauses even when her lead guide insisted. She stood at the front of the group during stops with her poles planted, visibly impatient, sighing loudly in the cold air. Now, I'm no pro climber, but I think refusing rest at that altitude is basically refusing your own survival margin. She had also developed a habit of pacing ahead of her own group during rotations. Not by accident, she was deliberately outwalking the people she was supposed to be moving with, forcing her Sherpas to close the gap, re-establish rope security, recheck anchor connections she had blown past. From the outside, it probably looked like drive. From the inside of her team, it was a constant drain. Every rushed clip in, every skipped visual check, stacked risk on top of risk in a place where the stacking eventually became structural. Riku, another climber on a separate permit whose team briefly shared the route with hers, described a bottleneck near a fixed rope section where multiple groups had slowed to allow a safe single-file crossing. Bianca had apparently waited about 45 seconds before announcing loudly to no one in particular, "Move or get moved." Riku said she repeated it twice. Nobody moved faster. They just started avoiding eye contact with her. Honestly, I read that as pure entitlement. I don't see leadership there at all. Just someone trying to force control in a place that punishes ego immediately. The incident near the ladder crossing happened earlier, back in the icefall, but it kept coming up in conversations because it captured something specific about how she operated. A climber was still completing a crossing over a deep crevasse when Bianca stepped onto the same ladder from the opposite side. The ladder swayed. The descending climber froze. A guide called out for her to wait. She looked up and said, clearly and without hesitation, "This isn't kindergarten. Keep moving. People remembered it because you don't talk like that up there. Not because of some unwritten code of mountain etiquette, but because the person on that ladder with you is tethered into the same system you are. Their panic becomes your problem. Their slip becomes your emergency. The mountain is already trying to kill you. There's no bandwidth left for ego." The communal storage incident happened around this time too. Bianca had misplaced a glove liner and spent a loud, disruptive afternoon tearing through shared gear areas, accusing a kitchen worker by name of moving her things. Other climbers watched from a distance. The liner turned up later that day, clipped inside her own duffel exactly where she had packed it. There was no apology, not even a gesture toward one. She just zipped the bag, asked someone nearby for hot water, and moved on. Two separate climbers mentioned that incident specifically when recounting what she was like. Not the outbursts at Sherpas, not the ladder crossing, the glove, liner. Something about the smallness of it stuck with people. The guides who observed her during this phase noted something that the rest of us might have missed from the outside. She wasn't actually moving efficiently. She was burning energy at a rate that made her timelines mathematically impossible to sustain. All the rushing, the confrontations, the refusal to rest, these weren't saving her time. They were eating through her reserves in a place where reserves were everything. The climbers she was trying to outrun, the ones she dismissed as slow and overly cautious, were actually pacing themselves for an 8,000-meter peak. She was pacing herself for a boardroom sprint. From my perspective, this is classic self-sabotage. She wasn't racing the mountain. She was racing her own misunderstanding of it. The mountain at that point was already ahead of her. She was already dead, and she doesn't know it yet. Everest forecasts don't arrive as dramatic warnings. They spread quietly through radios, sat phones, and camp rumors. Experienced climbers watch patterns, not just numbers. Wind shifts, pressure changes, small signs that matter. Those subtle changes are what make good guides start rethinking summit plans. By the time Bianca's team reached Camp 3, those signals were already arriving. Camp 3 sat on the Lhotse face, a sweeping wall of blue glacial ice angled at roughly 50 degrees, fixed ropes running the length of it like stitching on a wound. It was not a comfortable place to stop. Tents had to be cut into the ice shelf with considerable effort, and sleeping there meant the constant awareness that you were essentially bolted to the side of a frozen cliff at 24,000 feet. The air held maybe a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Cognitive functions started degrading in measurable ways up there. Reaction time slowed, decision-making became unreliable, and the emotional regulation that kept people calm under pressure began to erode. Most climbers at Camp 3 got quieter, more deliberate, more willing to listen. However, Bianca got louder. The forecast changed during an evening briefing. The summit window was shrinking faster than expected. Strong teams immediately discussed delaying their push and waiting for conditions to stabilize. On Everest, conservative decisions aren't weakness, they're experience. When the possibility of a delay came up among the climbers gathered near the camp's shared radio point, Bianca's response was immediate. One climber, a Norwegian named Alexei, who had summited 2 other 8,000ers before attempting Everest, recalled her rolling her eyes before the guide had even finished his sentence. Then she said it, the line that spread through camp faster than the forecast update itself. Some of us came here to summit, not attend weather seminars. Alexei told me he actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because he couldn't believe anyone said something like that at Camp 3. You're not on a corporate retreat at 24,000 feet. You're in a place where the weather doesn't adjust to your schedule. I honestly think that line is pure arrogance. It shows she saw caution as weakness, which is exactly how people get caught out there. After that, teams started actively maneuvering to avoid sharing rope sections with her group. The physical signs were visible by then to anyone paying attention. Altitude fatigue at Camp 3 and above wasn't hypothetical. It was present in almost every climber to some degree. The question was always how severe, and whether a person was managing it or ignoring it. Headaches were nearly universal. Slowed speech showed up in extended conversations. Mild disorientation, losing track of time, repeating questions, small lapses in memory, was common enough that guides were trained to watch for escalation rather than onset. At least 2 members of Bianca's climbing group were showing clear signs. One had been moving significantly slower over the past rotation and had mentioned a persistent headache that wasn't responding to hydration. Another had been quieter than usual in ways her tent mate found unsettling. These weren't people who needed to turn around necessarily, but they needed monitoring, and they needed the pace adjusted around their current state. Bianca encouraged them to match her speed. Her lead Sherpa, a man named Pasang, who had been on Everest 7 times and had turned around twice when conditions demanded it, which in guiding circles was considered a mark of good judgment rather than failure, advised her directly that the group needed a rest day before considering any further upward movement. He laid it out plainly. The forecast was shifting. 2 team members were symptomatic, and the summit push would be stronger after recovery time. She told him the mountain was overhyped danger-wise. That phrase, overhyped danger-wise, had apparently become something of a trademark by this point. She had said it at base camp, said it again in the Western CWM, and now she was saying it at 24,000 feet on the Lhotse face with a deteriorating forecast and symptomatic teammates. Other expedition members had started repeating it to each other in the dry, exhausted way that people repeat things when they can't believe something is real. Pasang, according to a fellow guide he spoke with afterward, went quiet after she said it. Not angry quiet, just the kind of quiet that came from having nothing left to add. He had done his job. He had given her the information. The decision ultimately belonged to the permit holder, and Bianca Chayat had already decided. The summit push was still on. Delay was not a consideration. The weather advisories were suggestions, not constraints, and the people telling her otherwise were obstacles dressed up as experts. She started prepping her gear that night for the push to high camp. Storms on Everest start quietly. More wind, less visibility, snow drifting thicker by the hour. By the time people realize conditions have turned dangerous, they're already in it. The summit push began before dawn as usual, headlamps moving slowly upward, with the cold feeling less like weather and more like weight. Bianca was moving at the front of her group. That part wasn't unusual for her. What stood out was that other teams weren't on the same schedule. Alexei's group chose to hold at Camp 3 after morning radio updates confirmed the jet stream had moved in faster than expected. Within an hour, 2 other expeditions made the same call independently. No coordination, just shared data and the same conclusion. Bianca's group pushed anyway. For the first hour or so, conditions were uncomfortable but navigable. Wind was elevated but not yet dangerous. Visibility was reduced, but the fixed lines were still traceable. Pasang kept kept the group tight, calling back position checks more frequently than usual, shortening the interval between him and the climbers behind him. He was already compensating for what the forecast had told him was coming. Then, the wind shear hit. It didn't arrive as a single gust. It arrived as a sustained increase that kept climbing, 40 miles per hour, then higher, driving ice crystals horizontally across the slope in a way that made goggles nearly useless. The fixed lines were still there, but finding them required stopping, feeling along the surface, tracing the rope by hand rather than by sight. Movement slowed to a fraction of its earlier pace. Radio communication became difficult. The wind swallowed words before they could carry. Teams that were still on the mountain began clustering near anchor points, waiting for a break in the gusts, reassessing. This was instinct developed through experience. When visibility collapsed and wind made footing unpredictable, you stopped moving independently and you held position until you had enough information to move safely. Bianca broke from the cluster. She moved ahead, alone, into terrain that was no longer clearly visible. Pasang called after her. A second Sherpa tried to close the gap, but she had already put distance between herself and the group, and in those conditions, distance became something else entirely. Distance became isolation. In a whiteout, the fixed lines are the route. With no landmarks, the rope is the only thing separating safe ground from open mountain. Disconnecting between anchor sections normally takes seconds, but in a storm, exhausted and oxygen-starved, those seconds become dangerous. Bianca was now navigating those transitions alone, ahead of her rope team, in conditions that had pushed multiple experienced guides to stop moving entirely. From below, Pasang and the remaining group could no longer see her. Radio contact was broken up, fragmentary. One transmission came through, her voice wind-distorted, saying something that sounded like she was still moving toward the high camp. Then, static. The fixed line that her last known position corresponded to ran along a steep mixed section, ice and exposed rock, the kind of terrain that demanded precise foot placement and careful weight distribution even in good conditions. In wind and reduced visibility, it was the kind of place where the margin between a secure step and an insecure one was measured in inches. Other climbers who were still in contact with their teams later described the same sensory experience from that window, the sense that the mountain had stopped being a physical space you were moving through and had become something ambient, something surrounding you completely without edges or orientation. One of them told me it was the first time on any climb he had felt genuinely unable to tell which direction was down. That was the mountain Bianca was alone in. Fatigue at extreme altitude doesn't feel like normal exhaustion. It's not just tiredness after effort, it's a gradual mental and physical breakdown. Thoughts stop linking cleanly, movements need deliberate control, and everything slows slightly out of sync. You only notice it after the gap between intention and action has already widened. By the time Bianca had separated from her group, that gap had been widening for hours. Pasang had seen it in her movement during the approach, the slight over-reliance on the rope for balance, the hesitation at anchor points where she had previously moved without pause. He had flagged it in a radio call to the expedition's base camp coordinator, using the measured language that experienced guides used when they wanted to communicate concern without triggering panic. There was nothing more to do from that distance. What happened next came together through two primary sources, a partial account from a Sherpa named Tenzin, who had been moving on a parallel section of the route with a separate team and caught fragments of what unfolded, and a more detailed account from a climber named Maren, a German mountaineer on her second Everest attempt, who had held her position at an anchor point roughly 40 meters below the critical section and observed portions of what occurred between gusts. Bianca was on the fixed line above the traverse when Maren first spotted her. She was moving, but slowly, the kind of slow that read as deliberate from a distance, but, Maren said, felt wrong when you watched it carefully. Her movements had a quality of overcorrection, each step slightly adjusted after landing, each clip-in taking longer than it should have. The section she was approaching was a steep mixed pitch, ice and exposed rock running at a sharp angle, the kind of terrain that separated technical climbers from aspirational ones. In good conditions, with proper rest and full oxygen, it was demanding but manageable. In the conditions that existed at that moment, wind, reduced visibility, compromised oxygen flow, and a body running on fumes it didn't have, it was the exact wrong place to be moving without a rope team. Tenzin's account described hearing her before he saw her. Her breathing was audible even through the wind, which at that altitude meant she was working at a respiratory rate that should have stopped her 20 minutes earlier. Then came the transition point. Between two anchor sections, there was a short gap, maybe 6 feet of terrain where a climber had to unclip from one fixed line, cross a narrow ledge, and clip into the next anchor before continuing. It was a standard maneuver, documented in every briefing, practiced on lower sections during acclimatization. The technique required clipping into the new anchor before releasing the old one, maintaining continuous connection to the safety system throughout the transfer. Bianca unclipped from the first anchor before securing the second. The exact reason wasn't something anyone could say with certainty. Fatigue affecting fine motor sequencing, a momentary lapse in the cognitive checklist that altitude had been quietly erasing for hours, possibly a belief in that oxygen-starved moment that the transfer was shorter than it was. Whatever the calculation was, it was wrong. For a few seconds, she was standing on that ledge with no connection to the fixed line system at all. Maren said she saw it happen and understood immediately what she was seeing. She said she opened her mouth but didn't make a sound, the way you sometimes couldn't when something moved faster than your ability to respond to it. The gust that hit the section wasn't the largest of the day. Tenzin estimated it at somewhere between 50 and 60 miles per hour, which on that slope, on that ledge, with no anchor connection and compromised footing on wind-loaded ice, was more than enough. Bianca's balance went first, a sideways lean that her body tried to correct and couldn't. Her poles made contact with the ice once, the sound audible even through the wind, according to Tenzin, and then she was gone. Not gradually, not with any of the drawn-out struggle that people sometimes imagined when they thought about falls on mountains. Just there, and then not there, the storm closing over the space she had occupied as if it had been waiting. Maren held her anchor point and did not move for a long time afterward. The calls started going out within minutes. Pasung was already moving toward her last known position when a gust slowed everything further. At the anchor point, he saw the line unclipped on the approach side and knew what had likely happened before he even looked. He radioed base camp in short, controlled phrases, managing both the situation and his own reaction at the same time. Attempts to locate her immediately were impossible due to visibility collapse. Recovery efforts were delayed by weather conditions that made movement unsafe even for experienced Sherpas. Teams could not safely descend into the section she fell from until conditions partially cleared. No usable body recovery was completed. The terrain and storm conditions made it impractical and dangerous. Looking at the full picture, it's hard to frame this as anything other than a predictable outcome of a mindset that treated a highly technical, high-fatality environment like a performance dashboard. She didn't just ignore risk, she consistently reframed it as incompetence in everyone else. And up there, that kind of thinking doesn't get corrected in real time. It compounds until the mountain forces the correction itself. If there's any takeaway from her climb, it's that confidence without restraint on Everest isn't leadership or ambition. It's just a liability that eventually drags everyone around it into the consequences.